The year was 1887, and the high plains of Wyoming had a way of wringing the hope from a man. For Owen Prescott, hope was a foreign currency he had stopped trading in long ago. His world had shrunk to the boundaries of his sprawling, neglected ranch, a kingdom of dust and silence lorded over by the ghosts of what might have been. At 60 years of age, Owen was a man of considerable size, a mountain of flesh that seemed to have accumulated like soil settling over a grave. His breath came in labored rasps, and his heart hammered a resentful protest against the simplest of tasks. He had not always been this way. There was a photograph on the mantel, clouded with grime, of a younger, leaner man with a fierce pride in his eyes, his arm around a smiling woman named Mary. But Mary was gone, taken by a fever 20 winters past, and the pride in the man's eyes had long since been buried under layers of grief and fat. His life was a metronome of bleak routine. He rose before the sun, his great weight groaning against the ropes of his bed. He would tend to the cattle, his movements slow and ponderous, the work that once brought him satisfaction now just a mechanical necessity to keep the whole decaying enterprise from collapsing. He ate alone at a long oak table built for a family, his meals joyless and vast. The silence in the house was a physical presence, so deep and profound it seemed to have weight, pressing down on the floorboards, smothering the air. The town of Redemption Gulch, a raw collection of clapboard buildings 10 miles away, might as well have been on the moon. He went only when supplies became a desperate need, enduring the stares and whispers of the townsfolk who saw him not as a man grieving, but as a grotesque spectacle, a cautionary tale of letting go. Owen was in a state of stasis, a long, slow decay of the soul. He was not living, merely existing, waiting for the land to finally claim him as it had claimed his wife. He had resigned himself to this quiet, lonely end. It was all he felt he deserved. The arrangement was made on one of his rare, necessary trips to the trading post near the reservation. The Lakota had suffered a devastating winter, followed by a summer of drought that withered the corn and drove the last of the game from their ancestral lands. The government rations were a cruel joke: weeviled flour and rancid pork. Desperation had a sharp, metallic taste, and it drove good men to impossible choices. The elder, Chayton, a man whose face was a roadmap of hardship and dignity, approached him not as a beggar, but as a man making a grim treaty. He spoke in halting English, his eyes never leaving Owen's. He spoke of his granddaughter, Winona. She was 18, strong, and a hard worker. She could keep a home, cook, mend, and was of childbearing age. The elder's words were stark, stripped of sentiment. It was a trade, a life for many lives. His granddaughter's future in exchange for a dozen head of cattle and enough flour, salt, and blankets to see his people through the coming winter. Owen had stared, his mind a slow, muddy river. A wife. The word was an absurdity, a relic from another man's life. Yet, in the deepest, most desolate corner of his heart, a flicker of something stirred. Not desire, not hope, but a profound, aching loneliness he refused to name. He looked at the hard, barren land around him, at the empty house waiting for him, and heard the crushing silence that would greet him. He agreed. Winona arrived a week later, brought by her grandfather on a tired-looking pony. She stood before Owen's porch, a small, straight figure wrapped in a trade blanket, her worldly possessions in a single rawhide bundle. She was not merely beautiful, she possessed a stillness, a centered gravity that seemed at odds with her youth. Her black hair was parted in the middle, woven into 2 thick braids that fell past her waist. Her face was a perfect, solemn oval, her eyes dark and deep, and in their depths a fire of fierce intelligence and terror burned in equal measure. She did not look at him, but at a point just past his shoulder, as if studying the unyielding horizon she was now bound to. Her presence was a stone dropped into the stagnant pond of his life. The silence in the house was no longer empty. It was now charged with her fear and his discomfort. He was a 60-year-old man, broken and obese, and she was an 18-year-old girl, sold to him like livestock. The shame of the transaction sat heavy and sour in his gut. He motioned her inside with a clumsy jerk of his head, the first gesture in their new life together. The door closed behind her, shutting out the world and sealing them in, two strangers bound by a contract of desperation. The air in the house changed instantly. It was no longer just a tomb for his memories. It was now a cage for her future. The first days were a lesson in the architecture of silence. They moved around each other like celestial bodies locked in a miserable orbit, governed by forces they could not control but compelled to maintain their distance. Owen found his routines shattered. He was acutely aware of her every movement, the soft scuff of her moccasins on the floorboards, the quiet way she handled the pots and pans in the kitchen he had long neglected. He would show her things with grunts and points, the pump for the well, the woodpile, the smokehouse. He spoke only when absolutely necessary, his voice a rusty hinge. The stove draws from the left. We eat when the sun is high. Winona, for her part, was a phantom of quiet efficiency. She spoke not at all. Her silence was not submissive. It was a wall, a fortress she had erected around herself. Her eyes, dark and observant, missed nothing. She saw the thick layer of dust on every surface, the grime on the windows that choked the sunlight, the cold, dead ashes in the main hearth. She saw the faded photograph on the mantel and understood, with an instinct born of her own losses, that this house was a shrine to a ghost. She moved with a purpose that unnerved him, sweeping away the cobwebs of his neglect, scrubbing the floors until the wood gleamed, washing the windows until the harsh Wyoming light flooded the dim rooms. She was cleaning away his grief, and it made him profoundly uncomfortable. He felt exposed, as if her cleaning was an excavation of his soul. He retreated further into his gruffness, his monosyllabic replies becoming shorter, sharper. He would leave her food on the kitchen tablet, a slab of bacon, a sack of Flurand, retreat to the barn, finding solace in the familiar, unjudging company of his animals. Their meals were the tensest moments of all. They sat at opposite ends of the long oak table, the vast, polished space between them, a canyon of unspoken resentment and fear. The only sounds were the scrape of his fork on his plate and the delicate, almost inaudible sounds of her eating. He ate with the same joyless voracity as always, but now he felt her eyes on him. He felt judged by her stillness, by her small portions, by the quiet dignity with which she consumed the food he provided. He was her keeper, her provider, but in her silent presence he felt like the savage. He was the one who had bought a person. One afternoon he found her in his and Mary's old bedroom. He had kept the door shut for 20 years. She had opened it, and the stale air of the past had billowed out. She was standing by the bed, holding a small, silver-backed hairbrush, her fingers tracing the intricate floral pattern. The bed was still covered with one of Mary's quilts. Winona looked up as he filled the doorway, her eyes wide, not with fear, but with a kind of startled curiosity. "Get out," he rasped, his voice thick with a pain so old it was part of his marrow. She did not flinch. She placed the brush carefully back on the dusty dresser, her movements deliberate and respectful. Then she walked past him, her head held high, and the scent of sage and wood smoke followed her down the hall, an alien fragrance in a room that had only smelled of lavender and decay. He slammed the door shut, the sound echoing through the house like a gunshot, and leaned his great weight against it, his heart a trapped bird beating against his ribs. He was not just guarding a room, he was guarding the ruins of his heart. And she, with her silent, knowing eyes, had trespassed. The landscape turned on them in early November. The sky, which for weeks had been a sheet of indifferent blue, became a bruised, heavy grey. The wind picked up, howling like a thing grieving, and soon the air was thick with a blinding curtain of snow. The blizzard descended without mercy, a white fury that erased the horizon and imprisoned them in the house. For Owen, it was a familiar trial. For Winona, it was a new kind of cage. The storm raged for 3 days. The world shrank to the 4 walls of the ranch house. The constant, shrieking wind made conversation impossible, even if they had possessed the words for it. The cold was a living entity, seeping through the chinks in the logs, breathing its icy breath across the floor. They worked in a state of unspoken truce, driven by the shared, primal need for survival. He kept the fires roaring, his large frame a constant presence by the hearth as he fed logs into the flames. She sealed the windows with strips of cloth and ensured the dwindling food supplies were used with care, preparing hot, nourishing broths that warmed them from the inside out. On the second night, a sound like a pistol crack echoed from the main room. A heavy branch, laden with ice and snow, had broken from the cottonwood tree and smashed against the roof. A moment later, a steady drip began near the hearth. Water, dark and cold, splattered onto the floorboards. Owen cursed, a low rumble in his chest. He grabbed a bucket and placed it under the leak. It was a temporary fix. The leak would worsen, rot the roof beam, and threaten the integrity of the house. He knew he would have to go up on the roof, into the teeth of the storm, to clear the branch and patch the hole. It was a fool's errand, a task for a younger, more agile man. He pulled on his heaviest coat, his movements slow and clumsy. As he reached for the door, a small hand touched his arm. He stopped, startled by the contact. It was the first time she had willingly touched him. "No," she said. Her voice was quiet, but firm. "You will fall." He looked down at her. Her face was tilted up to his, her dark eyes filled not with fear for herself, but with a clear, rational concern. She saw him not as her captor, but as an old man about to do something dangerously stupid. "It must be done," he grunted, shaking her hand off, more out of habit than anger. She did not argue. Instead, she pointed towards the attic ladder. "There, from inside." She then gestured to a pile of spare tarps and shingles he had forgotten in a corner of the barn. She had seen them, catalogued them, remembered them. While he had been mired in his routine, she had been learning the landscape of her prison, every detail of its strength and weakness. He stared at her, a flicker of grudging respect cutting through his stubbornness. She was right. They worked together. He, too large to navigate the tight attic space, passed tools and materials up to her. She, nimble and light, moved confidently among the rafters, her form silhouetted against the grey light filtering through the hole. She worked with a focused intensity, her small hands surprisingly strong as she nailed the patch into place. He watched from below, handing her a hammer, holding a lantern, a strange sense of partnership settling over them. For those few hours, they were not captor and captive, old man and young girl. They were simply two people fighting a storm, protecting their shelter. When she climbed down, dusted with snow that had blown in, her face was flushed from the cold and exertion. A strand of black hair had escaped its braid and clung to her cheek. For the first time, he saw not the stoic symbol of his shame, but the girl herself, fierce and capable. Later that evening, the storm still screaming outside, she sat by the fire, mending one of his torn shirts. The silence between them had changed. The heavy, resentful weight was gone, replaced by something lighter, a quiet space of shared experience. He found himself watching her hands as she worked the needle, her stitches small and even. She began to hum, a low, melodic sound that was both haunting and beautiful. It was a song of sorrow, a lament for a lost world, but it filled the room with a humanity that had been absent for 2 decades. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud. "What is that song?" he asked, the question surprising him as much as it did her. She stopped humming, her hands stilling in her lap. She looked into the fire. "It is a song for those who are gone," she said softly. "My mother sang it." He said nothing more, but he did not retreat into his shell. He simply sat and listened as she, after a moment, began to hum again. In the heart of the blizzard, inside the house they had just saved together, Owen Prescott felt a thaw begin in a place he had thought forever frozen. He was listening to the song of her grief, and in it he heard an echo of his own. After the blizzard broke, The world was a pristine, blinding expanse of white. The air was sharp and clean, and the ranch, which had felt like a cage, now seemed like the only solid thing in an endless sea of snow. The shared ordeal had subtly but irrevocably altered the dynamic between them. The silence was no longer a weapon but a space they could comfortably inhabit. Words, when they came, were still sparse, but they were no longer purely functional. One afternoon, he came into the kitchen to find her grinding dried chokecherries with a stone mortar and pestle she had fashioned herself. The rhythmic, grating sound was earthy and elemental. She was making wasna, a traditional food of her people. He watched for a moment before speaking. "My wife Mary," he began, his voice rough with disuse, "she used to make preserves, from the berries down by the creek." Winona paused her grinding and looked at him. She nodded, a simple acknowledgement that he had shared something of himself, a tiny piece of the story locked in the closed-off room. It was an invitation, and a week later he found the door to Mary's room standing open. The air inside was fresh, the window clean. Winona had not disturbed anything, but she had aired out the stale grief, letting the light in. On the dresser, next to the silver-backed brush, she had placed a single eagle feather. It was a gesture of respect, an understanding that passed between them without a word. He began to notice things about her he had previously ignored. He saw the way she would walk the perimeter of the ranch every morning, her eyes scanning the snow for tracks, her senses more attuned to the land than his ever were. He saw her leaving scraps of food for the winter birds, a small act of kindness in a harsh world. One day he found her tending to one of his horses that had a nasty gash on its leg. She had made a poultice from willow bark and herbs she'd gathered before the snow, her touch gentle and confident as she cleaned the wound. "You have a way with them," he said, his tone one of gruff approval. "They are honest," she replied, not looking up from her work. "They do not lie about their pain." Her words struck him. He thought of his own pain, the mountain of it he had hidden beneath layers of silence and flesh. He had been lying about it, to the world, and to himself, for 20 years. He started making small gestures of his own. On a supply run to Redemption Gulch trip he now made with a grim sense of purpose, rather than just bleak necessity. He bought a length of deep blue wool cloth, the color of a twilight sky. He left it on the kitchen table without a word. The next day she was wearing it as a shawl. The vibrant blue was a stark and beautiful contrast to the drab grays and browns of the house. His perception of her had shifted completely. He no longer saw the transaction, the purchased bride. He saw Winona. He saw her strength, her quiet intelligence, her unyielding dignity. He saw the deep well of sadness she carried for her own lost family and way of life. A protective instinct, long dormant, began to stir within him. He was still an old, broken man, but he found himself wanting to shield this young woman from any more harm, to protect the fragile peace they were building. She, in turn, began to see past the grotesque exterior he presented to the world. She saw the profound loneliness in his eyes when he thought she was not looking. She saw the way his hands, though clumsy with his bulk, were still strong and capable when fixing a harness or splitting wood. She saw the weariness of a man who had carried a burden for too long. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of digging out snowdrifts, he collapsed into a chair by the fire, his breathing ragged, his face pale with exhaustion. She brought him a cup of hot broth without being asked, her presence a silent offering of care. He took it, their fingers brushing for a moment, and he met her gaze. In her eyes he did not see disgust or pity, he saw understanding. The emotional distance between them was shrinking, melting away like the snow under a spring sun. The thaw meant the road to Redemption Gulch was finally passable, and their supplies were perilously low. The trip was a necessity they could no longer postpone. Owen felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. In the isolation of the ranch, they had created their own world with its own fragile rules. The town was the outside world, a place of judgment and cruelty, and he knew, with a grim certainty, that it would not be kind. He brought the wagon around to the front of the house. Winona climbed up beside him, her back straight, her face impassive, though he could see the tension in her hands, clasped tightly in her lap. As they rode, the comfortable silence they had cultivated on the ranch felt different, thinner, a fragile shield against what was to come. The moment they drove down the muddy main street of Redemption Gulch, the staring began. Faces appeared in windows. Men stopped their conversations on the boardwalk to turn and watch them pass. Their gazes were a physical weight, a mixture of hostile curiosity and open contempt. They saw what their prejudice wanted them to see: a fat, old man who had bought himself an Indian squaw, a creature somewhere between a servant and a pet. The whispers followed them like flies. Owen kept his eyes fixed on the path ahead, his jaw tight. He felt a hot shame, but underneath it, something else was simmering, a cold, protective anger. He pulled the wagon up in front of the general store and lumbered down, his size making him an even more conspicuous target. "Stay here," he ordered Winona, his voice lower than usual. Inside the store, the air was thick with unspoken hostility. Mr. Callahan, the proprietor, served him with a clipped, dismissive air. As Owen paid for his goods, the door swung open and a group of men swaggered in. At their lead was Bill Donovan, a man whose arrogance was as much a part of him as his cheap cologne and cruel smirk. Donovan owned a small, failing freight business and compensated for his insecurities by bullying those he deemed weaker than himself. Donovan's eyes landed on Owen, then flickered to the wagon outside. A slow, ugly smile spread across his face. "Well, look what we have here, boys," he drawled, his voice loud enough for the entire store to hear. "Old man Prescott finally come down from his mountain, getting some supplies for your new housekeeper." He infused the word with a greasy insinuation. Owen ignored him, gathering his sacks of flour and sugar. He just wanted to leave. But Donovan was not finished. He moved to block Owen's path to the door. "I hear you paid a pretty price for her," Donovan continued, leaning in conspiratorially. "Tell me, Prescott, is she as wild in the bed as they say her kind are?" Something inside Owen, a line he had drawn long ago between his private grief and the public world, snapped. The cold anger ignited into a hot, white rage. He had not felt anything so fiercely in 20 years. He dropped the sacks. His movement was surprisingly fast for a man of his size. He grabbed the front of Donovan's shirt, his huge hand bunching the fabric, and slammed him back against a stack of barrels. The impact sent jars rattling on the shelves. "You will not speak of her," Owen snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl that silenced the room. His face was inches from Donovan's, his eyes blazing with a fire the town had never seen. "You will not look at her. You will not even think her name. Do you understand me?" Donovan, his face pale with shock and fear, could only manage a choked nod. Owen held him there for a moment longer, letting the man feel the sheer brute strength behind his rage. Then he shoved him away. Donovan stumbled back, catching himself before he fell, his bravado utterly shattered. Owen turned, picked up his supplies, and walked out of the store without a backward glance, leaving a stunned and silent room behind him. He loaded the wagon, his hands trembling with the aftermath of the adrenaline. He climbed back into the driver's seat beside Winona. She had seen it all through the store window. Her face was still impassive, but her eyes were fixed on him, and in their dark depths something new had kindled. She had seen him defend her, not just her presence, but her honor. It was an act of loyalty, an unexpected and powerful declaration. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, but the silence had transformed once more. It was no longer fragile, it was solid, forged in the fire of that confrontation. They had entered the town as a master and his purchased dependent. They were leaving it as partners, an unlikely us against the sneering, hostile them. Donovan's hatred, meant to divide and humiliate them, had only succeeded in binding them together. Bill Donovan was not a man to accept humiliation. Owen's public defense of Winona had been a direct challenge to his fragile ego, and it festered in him like a sickness. In the weeks that followed, a poison seeped through Redemption Gulch. Donovan, fueled by whiskey and resentment, spread vicious stories. He painted Owen as a lecherous old fool and Winona as a cunning savage who had him bewitched. He made crude jokes about her, his words always finding their way back to Owen through the gossip mill that was the town's primary form of entertainment. The threat was no longer just whispers and stares, it became palpable. One morning, Owen found the gate to his main pasture thrown open, his cattle scattered across the open range. It took him 2 days of hard, punishing labor to round them up. Another time, he found the word squaw painted in crude yellow letters on his barn door. He scrubbed it off before Winona could see it, his heart pounding with a cold, slow fury. He was being tested, and he knew Donovan was behind it. The man was a coward, striking from the shadows, trying to break him, to drive him and Winona out. The escalation forced them into an even tighter alliance. They became more watchful, more reliant on each other. Owen started carrying his Winchester with him everywhere, even just across the yard to the barn. Winona's quiet observation intensified. Her knowledge of the land became their first line of defense. She noticed things: he missed a broken twig on a trail that shouldn't be there, the nervous quiet of the birds that signaled a nearby presence. She was his eyes and ears. One evening, she came to him while he was cleaning his rifle by the firelight. "He will not stop," she said. It was not a question. "I know," Owen replied, not looking up from his task. "He wants to hurt you. He wants to take me." She said the words without inflection, a statement of fact, but he could hear the undercurrent of fear. He stopped his work and finally met her gaze. The firelight played across her face, highlighting the determined set of her jaw. "I will not let that happen," he said, his voice imbued with a conviction that surprised even himself. 20 years of apathy had been burned away, replaced by a singular, fierce purpose: to protect this woman, to defend the home they were now building together. This ranch was no longer a place for him to die, it was a place for them to live, and he would fight for it. The stakes had been raised from a matter of pride to a matter of life and death. The coming confrontation felt as inevitable as the setting sun. The attack came on a moonless night. A storm was brewing in the distance, the air thick and heavy with anticipation. Owen had felt it coming all day, a prickling on his skin, a sense of deep unease that had kept his rifle close at hand. Winona had been quiet and watchful, her senses on high alert. The first sign of trouble was the sudden, frantic barking of the dog, cut short by a sickening yelp. Silence descended again, heavier and more menacing than before. Owen grabbed his Winchester from its place by the door and blew out the main lantern, plunging the room into the dim, flickering light of the hearth. "Stay away from the windows," he ordered in a low voice. Winona needed no instruction. She was already moving, a shadow in the darkness. She did not cower or scream. She picked up the heavy iron poker from the fireplace, its weight a solid, deadly thing in her hands. Her eyes met Owen's across the room, and in that shared glance was a grim understanding. They would face this together. A voice called from the darkness outside, thick with whiskey and malice. "Prescott, we know you're in there, you old sow. Send out your little pet, and we might let you live to see the sunrise." It was Donovan's voice, joined by the drunken laughter of at least 2 other men. Owen moved to a position beside the main window, keeping himself shielded by the thick log wall. "You're on my land, Donovan," he yelled back, his voice a deep roar. "Leave now, or be carried off it." A shot rang out, splintering the wood of the door frame. The time for talk was over. Owen raised his rifle, sighted on a bulky shadow moving near the barn, and fired. A cry of pain ripped through the night, followed by a string of curses. He had hit one of them. What happened next was a blur of calculated chaos. Another shot shattered a window, sending glass spraying into the room. While Owen reloaded and fired back, keeping the men pinned down behind the water trough, Winona acted. She slipped out the back door into the kitchen garden, moving with a speed and silence that was breathtaking. She knew this land, every dip and shadow. She was not a damsel in distress waiting for rescue. She was a warrior defending her territory. Owen saw a flicker of movement near the side of the house where the men were concentrating their fire. He realized with a jolt of terror that Donovan was trying to circle around to the back. He was about to yell a warning when a scream tore through the night, not of pain, but of pure shock. He peered out to see one of Donovan's cronies staggering backward, clutching his face, a dark gash across his cheek. From the shadows of the woodpile, Winona emerged, the fire poker held like a weapon. She had created the diversion he needed. As the injured man stumbled away, Donovan, enraged, turned his attention to her. He raised his pistol. Owen's heart stopped. He had a clear shot, but Donovan was between him and Winona. In that split second, Owen did the only thing he could. He abandoned the safety of the house, bursting through the front door like an enraged bear, roaring Donovan's name. His massive form was a terrifying sight in the dim light. The sheer, unexpected audacity of his charge startled Donovan, who hesitated for a fatal second. It was all the time Owen needed. He didn't fire. He closed the distance and brought the heavy stock of his Winchester down in a brutal arc against Donovan's gun arm. There was a sickening crack of bone, and the pistol clattered to the dirt. Donovan howled in agony, clutching his shattered wrist. The fight was over. The other man, seeing his leader incapacitated, had already fled into the darkness. Donovan, cradling his ruined arm, glared at Owen with pure, unadulterated hatred before he too stumbled away, his threats dissolving into pathetic, pain-filled sobs. Silence fell, broken only by the sound of their own ragged breathing and the approaching rumble of the storm. Owen stood over the dropped pistol, his chest heaving, his body screaming with a pain and exertion it had not known in decades. Winona came to his side, the iron poker still in her hand. They stood there for a moment in the dirt yard, surrounded by the evidence of the battle-splintered wood, shattered glass, the metallic scent of blood in the air. The violence had stripped away everything but the essential truth. He had fought for her, she had fought for him. They had defended their home, together. In the quiet aftermath, as the first fat drops of rain began to fall, Owen finally looked at Winona. He saw the fierce strength in her, the courage that burned brighter than any fire. And she looked at him, at this great, broken mountain of a man who had charged into gunfire to protect her. In that moment, the last of the walls between them crumbled into dust. They went back inside, the storm breaking overhead in a cleansing torrent. The house was a wreck, the air acrid with the smell of gunpowder, but it was safe. It was theirs. Without a word, Winona took a cloth and began to tend to a shallow cut on Owen's forehead, where a piece of flying glass had grazed him. Her touch was gentle, exquisitely careful. The simple act of her tending to his wound was more intimate than any embrace. As she cleaned the cut, he reached up and gently touched her cheek, his calloused thumb brushing away a smudge of dirt. It was a gesture of profound tenderness, a question and an answer all in one. "Mary," he said, his voice quiet and hoarse. "She died in this house. After she was gone, the light went out. I thought it would be dark forever." He looked around the room, at the chaos and the destruction, and then back at her. "You brought the light back, Winona." Tears welled in her eyes, the first he had ever seen her shed. They were not tears of sorrow, but of release. "My name," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "is Wachiwi. It means dancing girl. My mother gave it to me." She had shared her truest self with him, the name from the life she had lost. "Wachiwi," he repeated the name, a soft prayer on his lips. "It's beautiful." He looked at this young woman, this dancing girl who had faced down terror with an iron poker and a spirit far stronger than steel. He saw the resilience that had carried her through the loss of her home, her family, and her freedom. He saw the quiet grace with which she had breathed life back into his dead house and his dead heart. And he felt a surge of emotion so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. It was not the memory of the love he had lost, but the overwhelming presence of a new one, a love he had never expected to feel again. It was a love born of shared hardship and mutual respect, quiet and deep as a river. Life on the ranch found a new rhythm, a new equilibrium. The broken window was replaced, the splintered door mended. The physical scars of the attack faded, but the bond it had forged between them was permanent. The silence in the house was now a comfortable blanket, filled with the easy companionship of two people who understood each other without the need for constant words. Owen began to change. He walked more, his movements less labored. He ate with more care, the joyless consumption replaced by shared meals with Wachiwi. He even began to lose some of the great weight he had carried for so long, the physical manifestation of his grief shrinking as the grief itself finally began to heal. He started talking about the ranch not as a burden, but as a future, pointing out to her which fields he planned to sow in the spring, which fences needed strengthening. Wachiwi, in turn, truly made the place her home. She planted a garden near the kitchen, her hands coaxing green shoots from the stubborn soil. The bright colors of squash blossoms and beans were a defiant splash of life against the muted landscape. She brought her own traditions into the house, filling it with the scent of burning sage and the soft cadence of her songs. She taught him the names of the stars in her language, her voice a soft murmur in the vast, quiet nights. Their marriage, once a grim contract of shame and desperation, had been reforged by their own hands into a genuine partnership, a sanctuary against the harshness of the world. One evening, months later, they sat on the porch as the sun bled crimson and gold across the western sky. The land, which had once seemed so empty and hostile to him, was now imbued with a quiet beauty. He looked at Wachiwi, at her serene profile outlined against the vibrant sunset. The 18-year-old girl he had purchased was gone, replaced by a confident, strong woman who was his partner in every sense of the word. He, the obese, 60-year-old rancher, the town spectacle, was gone too. In his place was a man who had found a reason to live, a man who had found an unexpected and profound love in the last chapter of his life. She turned and met his gaze, a soft smile gracing her lips. She did not need to speak. He did not need to speak. In the quiet space between them, a whole world existed, a world of shared struggle, of unexpected kindness, of deep, abiding affection. They had been two broken souls, thrown together by a cruel world, but in their shared isolation, they had found more than just survival. They had found resilience, they had found acceptance, they had found home.